There's a moment most people know but rarely name. You're in a situation that isn't working. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a dynamic with someone who keeps disappointing you. You can see clearly, or almost clearly, that staying is costing you something real, and yet you don't leave. Not because you've decided to stay, you just don't go. That gap between knowing and moving is one of the most psychologically dense spaces a person can occupy, and it almost never gets explained properly. People say things like, "You just need more confidence," or "You deserve better," and those statements, however well-intentioned, completely miss the mechanism. They diagnose the symptom and skip the system entirely, because the fear of walking away isn't about weakness. It isn't about low self-esteem exactly. It isn't even really about the other person. It's about what leaving means to the part of your mind that has been quietly running a very specific calculation, one you were never fully aware of. Let's talk about what that calculation actually is. The human brain does not evaluate situations the way a spreadsheet does. It doesn't look at current conditions and ask, "Is this objectively good for me?" It looks at what has already been invested and asks something much more loaded. Can I afford to lose what I've already put in? This is what psychologists call the sunk cost effect. And while most people have heard the term applied to money or bad business decisions, its emotional version is far more powerful and far less discussed. When you've spent time, emotional energy, vulnerability, hope, and patience on something, those aren't just experiences. They register in the mind as assets, as proof that something matters. And the longer that investment accumulates, the more the idea of leaving starts to feel like destruction, not relief. This is the first layer of the fear. You're not afraid of the person you'd be leaving. You're afraid of invalidating your own history. Leaving feels like admitting that all of it, every moment of patience, every moment of hope, every time you told yourself it would get better, was a mistake. And the mind resists that conclusion with surprising ferocity. Not because the conclusion is wrong, but because accepting it requires a kind of grief that most people aren't prepared for. It's easier to keep going than to feel what stopping actually means. But there's a second layer, and it operates even deeper. Attachment, real attachment, the psychological kind, doesn't form because a relationship is good. It forms because a relationship is intense, inconsistent, or emotionally activating. This is one of the more uncomfortable truths in relational psychology, and it explains why people often feel most attached to the relationships that cause them the most confusion. Intermittent reinforcement is the mechanism here. When positive responses, warmth, attention, connection, validation, appear unpredictably, the brain doesn't register the relationship as unreliable. It registers it as worth pursuing. The variability itself becomes the hook. You're not chasing the person. You're chasing the resolution of uncertainty. This is why logic fails in these situations. Someone can list every reason a dynamic is harmful, understand each one completely, and still feel magnetically pulled back. Not because they're irrational, because their nervous system has been trained through repeated cycles of disconnection and reconnection to associate that specific person or dynamic with a very particular kind of relief. Leaving doesn't just mean losing the relationship. It means voluntarily entering the discomfort of that unresolved tension with no guarantee of resolution. The mind finds that prospect almost unbearable. Here's something worth sitting with. The fear of walking away is often described as a fear of loss. And it is, but what specifically is being lost? Not always what people assume. In many cases, what feels most unbearable about leaving isn't the absence of the other person. It's the absence of a version of yourself that only exists in relation to them. The self that was chosen, the self that was trying, the self that believed things would change. Leaving means that self doesn't get to see how the story ends. This is subtler than it sounds. Identity in psychology is not a fixed internal object. It's partly relational, constructed through interaction, through being witnessed, through the roles we occupy in other people's narratives. When a relationship has been central to your sense of self for long enough, its ending doesn't just feel like losing someone else. It feels like losing a piece of the architecture that held you together. That's not weakness. That's how attachment works. But it does mean that what's really needed before walking away becomes genuinely possible is a reconfiguration of identity that doesn't depend on that particular relationship for its coherence. And that is internal work, not relational work. If you've been recognizing yourself in any of this, it might be worth pausing here. If you want more conversations like this one, subscribe and tell me in the comments what landed most. These are the topics worth going deeper on. There's also a third layer, one that operates through belief rather than emotion. Many people who struggle to leave a difficult situation carry, often without knowing it, a belief that their continued presence is what keeps things from getting worse, or that if they just explain themselves correctly one more time, the dynamic will finally shift, or that leaving before the other person is ready makes them somehow cruel. These beliefs rarely surface as explicit thoughts. They live in behavior, in the extra effort, the repeated explanations, the willingness to absorb costs that aren't yours to carry. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the responsibility trap. It's the pattern where a person's sense of their own goodness becomes tied to their capacity to manage someone else's experience. Leaving in this framework becomes an act of abandonment rather than an act of self-respect. This belief is often rooted early, in families where a child learned that love required management, where affection was conditional on keeping the peace, soothing adult emotions, or making themselves small enough not to cause disruption. The idea of prioritizing your own well-being can feel genuinely wrong, not uncomfortable, actually wrong. Walking away becomes morally loaded in a way it was never supposed to be, and so people stay, not out of love exactly, out of a sense of obligation that was installed long before the current relationship even existed. Let's be direct about something. None of this means staying is always wrong. The point isn't that leaving is the answer to every difficult dynamic. The point is that the decision to stay or leave should be based on clear, present tense reasoning, not on the weight of accumulated investment, not on the anxiety of unresolved attachment, not on a belief that your worth depends on your endurance. When people make that decision from those places, they're not really choosing. They're reacting to internal pressure that feels like a reason but functions like a trap. The question worth asking isn't, should I leave? The more precise question is, what is actually keeping me here? Because the answers to that question tell you something important, not just about the relationship, but about the psychological architecture underneath it. Sunk cost. That's grief that hasn't happened yet. Intermittent reinforcement. That's a nervous system trained to chase resolution. Identity entanglement. That's a self-concept that hasn't been updated. Responsibility belief. That's someone else's framework that got installed in the wrong place. Each of these has a different texture. Each produces a different quality of staying, and each points towards something specific that needs to shift, not in the relationship, but internally. There's a version of this fear that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most clarifying one. Some people aren't afraid of what they'll lose when they leave. They're afraid of what they'll find. If you remove the noise, the conflict, the longing, the cycles of hope, what's left? Who are you when you're not managing this? What does your life look like without the emotional occupation that this relationship or dynamic has been providing? For some people, that question is more destabilizing than the relationship itself. This is what makes certain dynamics so difficult to exit, even when they're clearly damaging. The relationship isn't just painful, it's also structuring. It fills time, provides a narrative, creates urgency, generates meaning, however difficult that meaning is. Leaving doesn't just create space, it creates emptiness. And emptiness is its own kind of confrontation. This is not a pathology. It's a very human response to the prospect of unstructured psychological space, but it does mean that the capacity to walk away isn't purely a matter of courage or clarity. It also requires a certain tolerance for ambiguity, a willingness to inhabit uncertainty without immediately filling it with something new or retreating to something familiar. That tolerance is built, not innate, not permanently fixed at whatever level it currently sits. There is something particularly important in the relationship between clarity and action. Most people assume that if they understood the situation clearly enough, movement would follow automatically. That insight produces change, but in practice, the gap between understanding and action is often wide, and understanding alone doesn't close it. You can know that something isn't working and still not leave. You can understand exactly why you're staying and still stay. And that's the part most people don't talk about, the humiliation of knowing better and still not moving. The quiet fear that maybe this says something about you. That layer isn't logical, it's deeply personal. This isn't failure of intelligence. It's a gap between cognitive understanding and embodied readiness. The mind processes the logic. The nervous system hasn't yet found walking away safe. This is why change in these patterns tends to be gradual rather than sudden, and why the shift, when it happens, often feels less like a decision and more like something quietly settling into place. A threshold reached, a calculation completed in a part of the mind that operates below conscious awareness. The process rarely looks heroic. It usually looks like someone who finally got tired in a different way than before. Tired not of the situation, but of the cost of staying in it. One more thing. The fear of walking away is sometimes confused with love, with depth of feeling, with proof that the relationship mattered. But genuine love, the kind that sustains rather than depletes, doesn't require this particular fear. The intensity of your attachment to something that isn't working isn't a measure of how much you care. It's often a measure of how unresolved the underlying psychological question is. Intensity is not depth. Difficulty is not meaning. The hardest things to leave are not always the most valuable. Sometimes they're the most familiar, the most activating, the most tied to questions about yourself that you haven't yet answered. And that is a very different thing. What this whole pattern reveals, when you see it clearly, is that the fear of walking away is almost never really about the thing you'd be walking away from. It's about the internal systems that have formed around it. The investments, the attachments, the identities, the beliefs about responsibility, the discomfort with uncertainty. Those systems don't care whether the relationship is good or harmful. They care about stability, continuity, and the avoidance of certain very specific kinds of discomfort. Understanding that reframes everything. It means the question of whether to leave becomes less urgent than the question of what's actually generating the fear. Because once that's visible, once you can see whether it's sunk cost grief, or attachment anxiety, or identity entanglement, or a responsibility belief installed years before this situation existed, the decision itself becomes clearer. Not easy, but clearer. The architecture underneath the fear doesn't disappear because you name it, but naming it changes your relationship to it. You stop experiencing the pull as evidence that staying is right. You start seeing it for what it is, a pattern running its course, a mechanism doing what mechanisms do. And that shift in perception, from "I can't leave" to "I understand why leaving feels impossible right now," is not a small thing. It's the difference between being inside the system and being able to see it. Once you can see it, you're no longer entirely inside it, and that is usually where things begin to change.